How to write your first e-learning storyboard, e-learning storyboarding 101, and welcome everybody. Um, I'm curious to know, if you don't mind, I'm going to clear out the chat real quickly. I'm curious to know, for you as a e-learning designer, I'm assuming most of you are e-learning designers or getting into e-learning, the field of e-learning design, and even if you're not, I'm curious to know what is the most difficult thing about storyboarding for e-learning for you. When you're writing a storyboard, what's the hardest part? Or if you've been doing it for a while, and you've become a little bit better at it. When you first started writing storyboards, what was the hard part for you? So Julie says starting. Yeah, getting started. I agree. Where to begin? Janelle, organizing content. That's a great topic, and we're going to talk about that. Where to begin? What formatting works best? Chunking in appropriate amounts. I agree. What to include? Putting in all the details. Where to begin? You know what? Remind me. One thing I don't have a slide for is how much content to include. And if I don't mention that, remind me to mention that because I have an interesting story on that. Getting content from subject matter experts, that's a really good one. Finding a template, where to start, coming up with meaningful practical activities, I agree with that. Having confidence that you understand the material, totally agree with that. Getting everyone on board, that can be a very, very hard thing to do. Being able to move topics around. Linda, sticky notes work best for me, and we're going to be talking about how you can use sticky notes. That's a really great point. Thinking of cognitive overload, I agree with that as well. Well, one thing I will mention before we jump in, this call is about the process of storyboarding. How do you gather content? How do you organize it? How do you put it in a storyboard? How do you get it reviewed and get everybody bought into the process? So I will mention that we aren't talking about instructional design strategies because I do see the process of writing a storyboard, the actual procedures, and instructional design philosophy, techniques, two different things. Now, with that being said, I will, if a question comes up about certain instructional design topics, of course we'll talk about it. But this is really on the process of storyboarding. How do you create it? How do you get it organized? How do you collect your content? How do you get subject matter experts to review it? But yes, everything that you guys have written are all valid reasons why storyboarding is difficult. Um, and when you think about writing a storyboard, there are a lot of things that can really overwhelm you. I mean, there's so many things you have to think about when creating a storyboard, and these things all have to somehow be fit. They have to fit and go into your storyboard. Whether it's your learning objectives, making sure you cover those and get those integrated. There are business goals that you want to try and accomplish through your learning objectives. You want to make sure you meet those. Obviously, you need to plan for some sort of interactivity. You need to get that built into your storyboard, and not only do you need to include it in your storyboard in the sense that you have to include it in your course, but you also have to find a way to easily communicate what that interactivity looks like in a written format on a storyboard, and that's not always easy. Not only that, you have to deal with your subject matter experts. Subject matter experts aren't instructional designers most of the time, and so you have to create a storyboard that they can review and easily understand and have some sense of what's on paper and what it's going to look like on the screen. That's a big hurdle for a lot of people. You have to think about the visual design of your course, which I think is a big mistake people make, is they storyboard without thinking about what all of those words are going to look like on the screen. You have to think about performance goals, because there's a difference between learning objectives and performance objectives or performance goals. And then, of course, and I put this last, oddly enough, when it really should be first, is your learners. You have to think about your learners and how they are going to assimilate that content, and is it going to work well for them? And I know some of you mentioned cognitive overload. Are you giving too much or too little? And all those things can be competing interests when developing a storyboard, and can be overwhelming. Where do you begin when you have to meet all of these individualized goals? I'm curious to know, where do you guys start when you start creating a storyboard? Do you start with a written storyboard, or do you start developing slides on a screen? Where do you typically start? And there's no correct or incorrect answer. I'm just curious to know where everyone else starts. So Jeff starts in slides. Some people start in PowerPoint, slides to screen, words, old school, paper, I agree. Tim does a mind map, a mix of both, paper, yeah. Words and pictures on a screen. All right, sounds like people start a little bit everywhere, and this is one of the things that when I started in e-learning development, really struggled with, is should I start opening up my authoring tool, whether it be PowerPoint or Storyline or Captivate or whatever it might be, Should I start creating slides, or should I start writing a storyboard, or where do I begin? And it's kind of like the chicken before the egg kind of question. Where do you actually start developing a course? And this can be hard for some people because your instinct is to start developing slides because that's ultimately going to be the end product for most e-learning in some way or another. I prefer, my preference is to start with a written storyboard. I think that is the easiest, best place to start. Not to say that you can't, on the side, also create some slides, and I'll tell you why I think this is important as we move forward. But I think the best place to start when storyboarding is to create a written storyboard. Now, with that being said, there are some people who prefer to storyboard directly within the tool. They create kind of a rapid prototype storyboard, and there's nothing wrong with that. A big part of whether or not that works or doesn't work for you is your subject matter experts, I think, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But I prefer to start with a written storyboard, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'll explain why. And I'm going to do that now. Why start with a storyboard? So for those of you who do start with a written storyboard, I'd like you to justify that because there are people who disagree with that. I'm curious to know, why do you, if you start with a written storyboard, if you start by typing words, why do you do that? What's the benefit of that? So Michelle says, it helps keep me focused on the content instead of getting sidetracked by visuals. For me, it helps stay on track. It can be quicker to get ideas down. A narrative dictates the visuals. I like that, Kevin. Julie, so I'm not tied to the order of the picks. It can rearrange text and content. You're not tied to images. Makes it easier to make updates when needed. I love that, Linda. I'll talk about that too. It's easier to cut and paste and edit. When on paper, it helps me focus on visuals, flow, and keeps me away from trying to develop before I know what I'm going to do. That's a great point. Good reference later in the project. Yes, I agree with all of those. I have really three reasons why I prefer, and you are welcome to disagree with me by all means, why I prefer to start with a written storyboard. And the first one is the instructional design. I think it's easier, as many of you mentioned, to focus on the content of your course. The content meaning the instructional design, what's going to be said to the learner, whether you say it with words on the screen or words in the audio narration. A good foundation of any course is the instructional design. Now, I do think that the instructional design is only as good, is only as effective as the visuals that go along with it, and I'll talk about that later. How do you go from a storyboard to the screen? But I think the best place to start is with instructional design, and I'll explain a little bit later why I think that's the best place to start, not only for you as an instructional designer or e-learning developer, but also it's best when you're working with your subject matter experts. And that's not going to be the case for all subject matter experts, and I'll get into that. But I think it's good for instructional design. The other reason, like I said, is your subject matter experts. You need to guide, as much as we hate having to do this, you have to guide your subject matter experts, your clients, whoever you're working with, your stakeholders, through the process, because most of them don't know what good e-learning looks like. Most of them have a skewed idea of what e-learning looks like. And so sometimes when you just throw some quickly thrown together slides that you might call a wireframe, your subject matter expert may not be able to understand what that is and how it correlates to a finished course. And they start picking it apart without realizing, hey, that's just a wireframe. And it also helps you guide the focus of your subject matter experts, where you can just get them to focus on the content before focusing on the visuals. And that's an important part of the process. I'll talk about that more as well. And then finally, I think starting with a storyboard helps with iterative design. I always struggle with that word, iterative design. Meaning, and some of you mentioned this as well, it's easier to make edits when you're working with words. It's easy to delete something and move it around. Rather than when you're working with a bunch of visuals or slides, it's harder to make edits and go back and change even the smallest thing, depending on how intricate your courses are. It's easier to edit things when it's still in a document format, and we'll talk more about that as well. So, for those of you who use written storyboards, I'm curious to know, what does your storyboard look like? What does your storyboard include? What different elements do you include on a storyboard? When you write out a storyboard, I'm curious to know, what detail do you go into? If you don't mind typing that in chat. Leslie, goals, objectives. I agree. Objectives, script, rough idea of visuals. I agree with that as well, Amy. Anyone else? What other things might you include in your storyboard beside what's been mentioned? I see several of you are typing. Text for the slide, narration scripts, visual ideas, or even actual visuals. Direction for the developer. I agree with that. Word count. Oh, I like that one, Kevin. Slide narration, visuals, planned interactions. That's important. And handouts, job notes that we may need to develop to support what's being taught. I like that, Shannon, as well. Many people don't think to include that as a storyboard, but when you're thinking of e-learning being one piece of a broader learning ecosystem, if you will, I'm going to be really technical, it might be important to include that detail. Links to other documents. Yeah, so the reason why I ask that, and navigation, I like that, Jeff. I'll mention that as well. The reason why I ask that question is because there is no one format for a storyboard. Storyboards come in many different sizes and shapes and even colors. Storyboards are very diverse, and there is no one particular format you should be using. Storyboards include a lot of detail. They can include a lot of detail, or they can be very minimalistic. Storyboards might include narration dialogue. You know, if you're going to be having an e-learning course that has scripted audio narration, obviously you'll probably want to include that narration dialogue. Your storyboard might include some sort of programming notes. If you are just simply an instructional designer and you're going to be handing your course off to an e-learning developer to put it together in an authoring tool, you might need to include some programming notes about what happens when a user clicks on a button, or what are some navigation restrictions that are in place. Slide numbers. You know, you might want to reference a specific slide number. That's something typically put in a storyboard. And you might use those slide numbers not only just so it's easier for editing to identify an individual slide, but those slide numbers might correlate to the authoring tool. They might also correlate to audio narration files. It's very important if you have your audio professionally recorded, or even if you don't have your audio professionally recorded, even if you're just doing it yourself and you're recording your audio narration, it's important to know what file goes with which, slide of dialogue. And so you might use slide numbers to help organize that content. And two things popped up that wasn't supposed to happen. But learning objectives. You might include learning objectives. You might also include in your storyboard at the beginning, there might be sections to outline the objective of the course, the purpose, the audience, the stakeholders, the business objectives, the performance objectives, all sorts of stuff like that might be included in a storyboard, especially if it's something that's going to be used not only for designing the course, but also used for ongoing strategy discussions with your stakeholders, if you will. Interactivity notes, kind of going back to the programming notes. You might include some interactivity notes. If you have a branching scenario, you might need to explain, especially for your subject matter experts, if they're not e-learning developers, you might have to include notes that say, there are two buttons on the screen. If the user clicks button 1, it'll take them down this path. If they click button 2, it'll take them down this path. It's important to include that detail because, again, the people reviewing your course may or may not have an understanding of what e-learning is or interactivity is. And graphic suggestions. Yeah, many of you mentioned this. You might have graphic suggestions to include, details about what image might be used to represent the content. You might actually include images in your storyboard, pictures that you might use or graphics that correlate to the text. Again, that's important to help your people reviewing it or people designing your course to visualize what might be on the screen. A slide-to-slide flow chart. This is another thing that I do in my storyboards. I don't think anyone mentioned this, but if I have a course that I know is going to have some complex branching, let's say we're going to have a main menu and the learner is going to go down these different sections, I might include a slide-to-slide flow chart, kind of like a visual table of contents at the beginning of my course where there's boxes for each individual slide, and it shows how the course is navigated so that when your subject matter experts review the course, they might have some sort of mental map about the way that course flows. And Amy, just like StoryView and Storyline, where you can see that high-level overview. I might do something like that to help people visualize from slide to slide how the learner progresses. Because when you're working with a written storyboard, it's linear. You have slide 1, slide 2, and it goes, from top to bottom. So it's hard to visualize branching navigation in a storyboard. So I might include something like that. And then Jenny says, what do you use to show flowcharts? They get so big. Yeah, it depends. It depends on how large the course is and how much detail you want to go into. Sometimes I'll build something, simply using shapes and lines in PowerPoint. I might keep it at a high level. I may not represent every single slide within it. I might say, here's my introduction, and that's one box, and that indicates slides 1 through 5. And then I might have a box for the main menu, and it shows a branching to, section 1, which might be slides 6 through 10, and then 11 through 15, and then 16 through 20 in separate boxes. It depends on the size of your course and how much detail you want to go into. But there are all sorts of flowchart tools out there. Shannon mentions Lucidchart. I've never heard of that one before. I'll have to check that out. But anything where you can visualize that the structure of your course, you might include in a storyboard. So I follow a 5-step process when creating my storyboards. And this process has worked for me whether I'm working with an internal customer, a subject matter expert, a stakeholder. I'm working with external clients. If any of you are freelancers or work with external clients, this process has also worked for me as well. And the first step is, as I'm sure you might imagine, is gathering your content. And this can be one of the more frustrating steps in the process. I won't know. Actually, I'm going to take that back. I don't think it's the most frustrating step, but it can be one of the more overwhelming steps, is gathering content from your subject matter experts. And again, I want to emphasize not talking about instructional design. Obviously, gathering your content and analyzing your content and sorting through your content and figuring out what's needed for your audience is part of instructional design. I'm talking about this as more of a procedural step for storyboarding. And how you gather your content depends on who you're working with and the topic of your course and whether or not you're a subject matter expert yourself in that topic. But the first place, obviously, you probably want to meet with is your subject matter experts. You want to get content from them, find out, their perceptions on the process. What do they want learners to do? What are learners actually doing? One thing I will forewarn you about meeting with subject matter experts is subject matter experts are very passionate about, they should be, or they tend to be, very passionate about the topic that you need to create training on. And they're passionate about A, because it just might simply be a passion for them, or B, they have certain performance goals tied to your training. They need people to do something differently because they're responsible for certain business objectives related to that. And so subject matter experts tend to be passionate, and I will go as far as to say overly passionate about a specific topic. But meeting with your subject matter experts gives you an opportunity to see from their perspective what the process should look like, what the procedure should look like, and all of the information you might need to get from them. And one of the stories, and I'm going to tell this now so I don't forget it later, just to show you an example of why subject matter experts tend to be passionate, is one thing I've learned is subject matter experts oftentimes want their learners to be just as knowledgeable or just as passionate as they are. And I think those are unrealistic expectations. And so one of the things I would tell you to do is when you're meeting with your subject matter experts, be aware that they're going to probably give you more detail or more information or request you to include more information in the course than that might actually be necessary. A good example of this is a few years ago, we were working with a client it was a military client, and they wanted us to create a course to explain or to teach soldiers or anybody working, say in Iraq or Afghanistan or any war zone, to be able to identify if there is an IED in the road ahead of them. And if you don't know what an IED is, it's essentially it's called an improvised explosive device. So the purpose of the course was to help people, if they're out in the field in a war zone, be able to identify, is there a potential explosive device in the road ahead of you? So you can avoid that and save your life. And our subject matter expert, our client, was very passionate about this topic. And they wanted us to include like this 30-minute introduction about the history of gunpowder and how gunpowder was invented by the Chinese and thousands of years ago, and how that relates to, the creation of IEDs, which is all great. That's great, fun information. It's something you might see on the History Channel, right? But we rebutted on that. We pushed back on that. And the reason why we pushed back on that is although that's great information, if I'm a soldier or a military contractor or whoever in the field, and I think there might be an IED in front of me, I don't care about the history of gunpowder. That does not matter to me in that moment. All I care about is how do I save my life and how do I not get exploded by an IED. And this is a great example where subject matter experts, because they're so passionate about the topic, they'll want to include all that great information about the history of gunpowder. But the truth is, learners don't need to know the history of gunpowder in that example. They just need to know how to identify an IED. So when you're working with your subject matter experts, you have to filter the amount of content they give you. Another thing you can do is job shadow with your learners. And I'm curious, actually, before I go, has anybody else experienced that? Has anyone else experienced subject matter experts being overzealous with the amount of content you have to include? They want everything, right? They want the learners to be just as passionate as they are, and that's not realistic. So the other thing you can do, and Fred, with every project with a period, yes, with every single project, that's so true. The other thing you do is job shadow your learners, and I think this is important because you need to keep a balance between your subject matter experts and your learners. If you only trust your subject matter experts, you could be creating a situation where you're not getting a realistic view of what the learners experience, because oftentimes subject matter experts have a distorted view of what it's actually like for people actually on the job. And I used to work at Kohl's department stores in their corporate office in Wisconsin. I was there for about 6 years. And one of the things and I had worked in the stores prior to that. And anybody who had worked in the stores, you could see from a mile away somebody who's never worked in a store in their life. They've never worked in a retail environment. And they have these kind of rose-colored glasses that they're wearing, this perception about what it's like to work in the stores. And so it's easy for subject matter experts just to talk about the policy and the procedure, and they think everybody's following that procedure in some capacity or another, and they think that it's very clear cut and black and white. But the reality is what your learners experience day to day can be vastly different from your subject matter experts or stakeholders' perception of that. And so the important thing is to keep a balance between helping your stakeholders, your subject matter experts, your business partners, and your clients meet their business objectives, but also helping your learners get what they actually need. And so I always encourage, doing some sort of job shadowing, even if you have to just go out for a few hours and just see what their life is like with that particular procedure. It will help you, and this is important, it will help you empathize with what their job is actually like. And that can be very helpful with your content because you can include details about, their common struggles. And it builds credibility. Yes, Leslie, it builds credibility. And if you can include that detail in your course, it can help your learners engage with the course because they're going to be like, oh, this is actually speaking to what it's like on the job, because they're so used to just hearing the stuff coming down from corporate or the big learning and development department. And they have this, or they already have a perception that you don't really know what their life is like. And so it can help build credibility and help you advocate for your learners even more. I always tell people to review company best practices for two reasons. First off, you might get a more accurate view of what the procedure is supposed to look like, because sometimes subject matter experts aren't always in alignment with the company best practices. Okay, those can be two different things, and also learners may not be in alignment with company best practices. But what's even more important about this is through all of your research, you might find that there are a lot of holes or missing information in your company's best practices. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a client and they want us to teach on a certain policy or procedure. And my first question to my subject matter expert is great, that's great information. Can you provide me your best practices, the actual formal policy written documentation? And they don't have it. And there is sometimes a perception from your subject matter experts that you, by creating the learning, you're creating the best practice. And that is not, or should not be, the case. The learning and the company best practices are two different things. Company best practices are the policies, the procedures, the written documentation. Your learning is training to those best practices, all right? And so you might find that there may not even be best practices in existence in the first place, and you might have to help your subject matter experts create that as well. Or you might find there's a lot of holes, and those holes might be what's causing the confusion that requires the learning in the first place, right? So it's important to review company best practices as well. And then finally, Google it. Whenever I'm working on a topic, I Google it to see what else is out there, to get a different perspective. You might think you're working on a very specific company proprietary, if you will, company-specific topic. But if you Google it, you might be surprised to find out there's a lot of other information out there that you might be able to use in your learning content, whether it's people creating e-learning courses on the same topic outside of your organization, or just general information that you may not have considered that you might want to include. So I always say Google it. See what's out there. You never know what you might find. So the first step is gathering your content. The second step, and I said earlier I was going to take back what I said about gathering being the most frustrating part. Organizing your content, I will say, can be the most frustrating part. The thing about organizing content is you get all of this content from your subject matter experts through your research. You have all of this content. And the struggle is how do you take all of this content and get it into a storyboard? And that can be very, 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 very difficult and very, very, very frustrating and very, very, very overwhelming, especially if you're new to e-learning. You might have a mental idea of what your course looks like, but the second that you're challenged to document that in a very clear and concise storyboard, it can just totally throw you out of whack and make you incredibly frustrated and overwhelmed because you have so much content to deal with. How do you pare it down to something that's ready for development in an authoring tool? And not only that, meets all of those objectives we talked about earlier, being able to make it so that your subject matter experts can review it, it's ready for development, all that great stuff. So the way that I choose to organize my content, and I think some of you might have mentioned this, is I like to use sticky notes to organize my content. I found this to be a very effective solution for me. And there's a couple reasons. It helps you compartmentalize your ideas, and it also can help you start building the structure of your course by using sticky notes. And I'm going to demonstrate this for you. Typically, when I'm working on a course, what I will do is I will go away from my desk. I will go find a wall somewhere outside of my regular environment, and I will just start writing a bunch of sticky notes. And typically what I will do is I will start by putting a bunch of sticky notes on the wall for all of my really important main topics, my main themes. Maybe there are your learning objectives, whatever it might be. I will create a sticky note for each of my main topics. It might be 3, it might be 4, it might be 5, it might be 20 main topics, who knows. But I will try and outline all of my main topics. And from there, I will take my content and I'll start identifying subtopics. What content lives underneath those main topics? And through this process, you might identify new main topics that you didn't realize. You might find new ways to group content that you didn't realize when you were looking at the content at a high level. And so you do this to start organizing where different content items live under larger, bigger content items or different themes that you might use throughout your course. And then from there, what I do is I start including sticky notes to indicate certain slides that I know I'm going to include in my course, right? So I have my main topics. I know I'm going to need a slide, if you will, on my learning objectives. I might need a slide or more slides on an introduction. I might include a conclusion and a quiz at the end. These are things that you know you're going to need in your course. So I start putting those, and I start putting them in relation to where they're going to live with the rest of my content. From there, what I do then is I start using arrows to kind of map out how is the learner going to progress from one topic to the next. So if they're going to start at the introduction, then they're going to go to the learning objectives and then, main topic 1, and then they might go to the subtopics. Whatever that, order in which the learner is going to go through that course, I will start identifying that by simply just drawing lines between those topics. And again, you might discover you need to rearrange the content. For example, let's say I decide I want it to be kind of a branching situation where I'll move my introduction learning objectives at the top. I might add a slide for a main menu, and then I'll reorganize it to show the branching, right? And then I might include additional sticky notes because I know, under, main topic 1, I need to have a system simulation because I'm going to be showing how to do something. Or under main topic 3, I might include a learning scenario because we're talking about, how the learner is going to interact with, another person or whatever that might be. And then conclusion and quiz might be at the end after the learner goes through that, 3 branching. So I use this to kind of help map out my ideas, but also through the process, you start building, if you will, kind of that structure, that visual table of contents about what your course is going to look like. And you can continue to get as detailed as you need to the point where each sticky note identifies a very specific slide within your course. And once you start doing this, the process of storyboarding your course becomes a lot easier because you know where to start. Start at the introduction. and then start writing learning objectives, and then start the main menu slide, and then you start writing a slide for main topic 1 and main topic 2 or whatever. And it starts guiding you through the process of writing your course slide by slide, which is the struggle that people have, is taking all that content and where do I even start? Slide 1, you know what I mean? This will help you organize that. I'm curious to know, for those of you, I know some of you have also mentioned using sticky notes. Does anyone else use a process maybe similar to this when organizing your content? And how has it worked for you? Yeah, it helps keep you on track. It helps you get into the weeds with a lot of content that you have. Yes, love post-it notes. I love it too. That's another great great point, Amy. If you're provided existing content, maybe an existing PowerPoint presentation from your subject matter expert, that's another thing you can do. Print it out and start organizing it in a visual space. Again, just taking that stuff and getting it out of your head and organizing in a visual space, whether it's sticky notes or printed slides, whatever it might be, it helps you start visualizing the content in an actual physical space. And Aaron, you create an Evernote notebook, and that works just as well. I agree with that. Tim, you use electronic mind mapping. I use that as well. And Amy, you mentioned your SMEs love to see when their PowerPoint is represented. I agree with that. Yes, and the important thing here, as Tim mentioned, is it gives you the opportunity to easily move stuff around. Good. So, once you've organized your content, the next thing you have to do is start drafting your content. And this is another roadblock a lot of people struggle with. And if I were to give you one tip, to start creating your course, because again, it's one thing to organize it visually with sticky notes. That's not too difficult. But then actually start writing your content, that can be hard as well. And the first thing I would tell you is just start typing something. I can't tell you how often I've sat there staring at the screen going, I don't even know where to start. And after hours and hours and hours of doing that, I finally get broken down to a point where I'm like, forget it. I just need to open up Word and I need to start typing something. And eventually, as you start typing just anything, no matter how awful it is something that you can start working with. It is something you can start organizing. It's something that you can start editing. You can't work with something that's not there. And so the first thing I always tell people is just open up Word, whatever word processing tool you use, and just start typing. Start typing at slide 1. If you don't want to start at slide 1, start typing, a specific section. Just start typing something to get yourself started. Also, I encourage you, and Fred says, David Allen, the GTD, calls this the awful first draft. Yes. Create an awful first draft. Just start typing. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be organized. And nobody needs to see it. But it's for you to just start getting things on paper. The worst thing you can do is just sit at your screen and stare at it wondering, where should I begin? And the reason why that is because we stigmatize being wrong. It's okay to be wrong. You have to be wrong in order to be right eventually. So just start opening up Word and start typing. The next thing I always tell people is write in a conversational tone. And this is especially true if you include audio narration. If your course is going to be narrated by an individual, you have to write in the way people speak. Okay? Business writing and writing for the spoken word are two very different styles of writing. It's okay to include fragment sentences. It's okay to say, so now that you've learned, you would never, typically in business writing, you don't start a sentence with so, comma, now that you've learned, you might, but, in more conversational dialogue, it's okay to include those things. And what Shannon says is stuffy equals boring. Yes, if it's stuffy, if it sounds too corporate-y, I don't know how else to describe it. If it sounds like it's like a written speech, it's going to sound boring. It's not going to be engaging. You want to write it in a way where it sounds like somebody is having a conversation with you, not just lecturing to you. So write in a conversational tone. Detail any specific programming notes, and we talked a little bit about this earlier. But especially if you're not going to be designing the course yourself in the authoring tool, make sure to be as detailed as you can possibly be about any specific programming notes, whether it be about the navigation of the course, whether it be about any certain type of animation you might want to include. Like you might say in the margin, you might have a box or a column that says, at this point, have something animate in or animate out or move across the screen. Detail as much as you can any specific programming notes, especially if you're not going to be developing it, but also if there's anything that's really important in terms of the meaning of the content. For example, animations. Animations can have some important meaning tied to the content. I'm doing another webinar on that in a few weeks on designing with animations. But if that animation or that movement or that anything happening on the screen that's not written or spoken has a specific meaning, you might want to detail that so that when your subject matter experts review it, that's getting communicated to them as well. So any specific programming notes as well. And then the last thing, this is the most important thing I think personally, and I've said this for years and years and years, is never, ever, ever storyboard anything you can't communicate visually, all right? We have to go back to square one about what is e-learning. E-learning is a tool for visual communications, right? And so if you storyboard content with a bunch of bullet points, what's going to end up on your slide? A bunch of bullet points, all right? So you have to constantly, and this is a struggle, constantly be thinking about how am I going to communicate this visually on the screen? It might include some text. It should hopefully include some images and graphics. And how are you going to do that? All right? What I always tell people is if you're storyboarding something and you can't figure out how that's going to be communicated visually on the screen, you need to go back and rewrite that because you need to figure out a way to say it that gives it a visual component or gives you the opportunity to communicate it visually. You have to constantly have that in the forefront of your mind as you're writing. How is this going to be communicated visually on the screen? And if you don't do that, once you get to the development part, when you're putting in the tool, you're going to have a really hard time communicating it visually. And that's how you end up with a bunch of bullet points on the screen. You don't want that. That's not good. And the way that I do this is another strategy you can use, another way you can use bullet points, or not bullet points. Another way you can use sticky notes is with a process I call story mapping. All right. So when you think of a storyboard, prior to you getting into e-learning, when people said the word storyboard, you probably thought of something like this, right? You think about it like a movie storyboard where people draw out, every scene within a movie. And I use this. I still do this as a way to help me kind of plan out, and this is strictly for me as a developer. I rarely, if ever, show this to my subject matter experts because they won't get it. But I use this to help plan for me, how am I going to communicate something visually? And I usually do this in tandem with my storyboard. And so here, say we have here's a sample storyboard on, campfire safety in the Prescott National Forest. And so you might say, here's a storyboard about what's the best thing about camping. It has to be the campfire. I'm not going to go through and read this, but it goes through some content about, here's Jim. He's about to go on a camping trip with his family. In this course, we're going to help Jim prepare, blah, blah, blah. And there's some important information about maintaining a safe campfire. Jim needs to make sure he brings the right supplies. At the very minimum, Jim should plan on bringing a gallon of water, a shovel, etc., etc. It also mentions that Jim needs to know where to properly place the campfire. Jim should place the campfire. Okay, so this is about campfire safety. So as I'm storyboarding this, I might also be on the side sketching out what each sentence is going to look like on the screen or each paragraph. So let me show you an example of this. Here at the beginning, we might say, what's the best thing about a campfire? And by all means, you do not need to be a drawer. I'm really good at graphic design. I'm horrible at drawing. So please bear in mind that these little sketches are absolutely awful. But I might include a sketch that I'm going to have a background of a campsite with some trees, and it's going to be a little bit blurry, and I might have some text across the screen that says, what's the best thing about a campfire, or best thing about camping? That might be my first slide, and might be the first build in a series of animations. I don't know. It's just an idea about how I might show that on the screen or represent that. So then we might say, and it has to be a campfire. A campfire is a great way to bond with friends and family, to stay warm during a cold night. Also, a campfire is meant to be enjoyed. It can also be dangerous if you don't take some simple precautions. So the same thing. I might have that background with the campsite. I might blur it out, and I might have 3 photos, one representing a family, one representing a campfire, one representing staying warm as a way to visualize that. Might I use that? I don't know. It's just a way to start thinking about it visually. Then our next section, we say, oh, this is Jim. He's about to go on a camping trip with his family. In this course, you'll help Jim prepare, blah, 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 blah. So again, I might have that background. I might introduce a character showing Jim on the screen, right? And then I might have a slide for a safe campfire with a little green check mark, or a wildfire with a red X. Again, visually, visualizing what might be here on the screen. I might include text. I might not include text on the screen. All right. To maintain a safe campfire, Jim needs to make sure he brings the right supplies. At the very minimum, Jim should plan on bringing a gallon of water and a shovel. If possible, it'd be helpful for Jim to bring a fire extinguisher, so forth and so on. So again, here's a slide. I might have Jim, he might be holding a checklist. I might visually show a checklist on the screen, and I might animate each of these items on the screen. Yes, they might be bullet points. I could think of different ways to communicate it. Maybe rather than text with bullet points, I might use an icon to represent each of these items. Who knows? But again, it's visualizing what that point in the slide might look like. And again, this might be a slide by itself. It might be a series of builds, of animations. Who knows? All right, from there, Jim also needs to know where to properly place the campfire. Jim should place the campfire a safe distance from where he will pitch his tent, etc., etc., etc. So again, here I might visualize this by showing a map or a diagram of what a campsite might look like, and I might use icons or graphics to indicate here's the campsite, here's a green check, or a red X where you shouldn't place something. Again, visualizing what that might look like. So this is what that looks like. I might keep this on the side. I might keep it in a notebook. I might keep it in Evernote. Who knows where you'll keep it? Wherever. All right? But this you keep with you to help you transition from your storyboard to your slides, to help you visualize that. Now I'm going to pause for a second, and I see there's a lot of typing in chat. So Diana, I apologize if I got that wrong. You said, I think the visual aspect is so overlooked, and if you do as Tim is showing, it really helps pull together elements, colors for your course. Great step to ensure a cohesive look and feel for a course. I completely agree. Again, the important thing is thinking visually. Fred says, would this process be different whether or not there is a voiceover? I don't know. I think you could still use this. The problem when you have a course without voiceover is that you have to compensate for the lack of voiceover with more text on the screen, right? So yes, you could probably still use this as a way to lay out your slides, as to show what pictures or visuals you might have on the screen, or blocks of text. Again, this can be as detailed or as vague as you want it to be. So I think it could be the same even if you don't have voiceover. But the thing about courses that don't have voiceover is that it usually gets compensated with more text on the screen. So you have to be aware of that. That's really the only consideration I can think of at the moment. If anyone else has any thoughts on that, feel free to put that in chat. I'd appreciate it. So, 5-step process. So we did draft. The next process is review. And again, if we're talking about this process of storyboarding being frustrating, I'm sure many of you have been frustrated with the review process when you're reviewing with your subject matter experts. Let me give you some tips on reviewing. The first thing you should always do is educate your subject matter experts, whoever's reviewing it, your stakeholders, your business partners, your boss, your clients, whoever is reviewing that course. Educate your subject matter experts on how to read a storyboard. Explain to them that each table, each box, each column, each cell, whatever it is, whatever the format is, educate them and explain to them, hey, this represents an individual slide. And then here in column 2, this represents the visuals. You really have to tell them what that means, because they're going to make their own assumptions. They're going to look at this dialogue on the screen and assume, oh, that's all the text that goes on the screen? Well, of course not. It's the audio dialogue, and they would not know that unless you told that to them in the first place. So you have to educate your subject matter experts on how to review a storyboard and what they should be looking at. You also need to tell them, hey, I only want you focusing on the content. Only focus on whether or not the content is accurate. All right? Don't focus on how it's written. Don't focus on it being written in a conversational tone. My personal opinion is it's none of their business. You are the instructional designer. It is their job to focus on the accuracy of that content. You have to be explicit in telling them that. All right? I think it's also important to tell them whether or not, what leeway you give them with having an opinion, if you will, or input or leeway on the structure of the course, because they might disagree with you on the structure of the course, the way stuff is organized, right? But you might have some instructional design reason for the way you structured it. And sometimes you have to justify that to them and educate them on that because they don't know otherwise. And then that goes into controlling the attention of your subject matter experts. And this goes back to why I'm not a big fan of developing slides before a storyboard. Because if you don't control the attention of your subject matter experts, if you don't tell them what to look at and what not to look at, they're going to sit there and look at your storyboard. And while they're supposed to be looking at the accuracy of your content, they're going to be sitting there nitpicking the images that you included in the storyboard, or nitpicking slide numbers, or something really, really dumb that you do not want them to look at. You have to tell them where to focus their attention. And if that means that you have to remove certain things from the storyboard that you don't need them to see at that time, then do that. Remove those images, remove those graphic suggestions, remove the programming notes if you have to. If it means that you need to get your subject matter expert to focus on the areas you need them to focus on. All right? Because otherwise they're going to start going way off track, and that can get really bad. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is get everybody in the same room. I can't tell you, first off, how often do you work on a project that only has one stakeholder or only one person who has to review it? That's very rare. You typically have a lot of people who need to review it, and there's a lot of people who need to approve it, and there's a lot of people who are going to have opinions. And it's very rare that those people's opinions and edits are going to be cohesive. Oftentimes they're going to conflict. And if you let each subject matter expert, each business partner, each stakeholder review it individually, and they provide you your edits and they conflict, then it's your job to figure out, well, who should I say is right and who's wrong? What do I do? So what I encourage you to do is get everybody in the same room, whether it's to actually review it or whether it's to debrief on the review. And in that way, if there is a disagreement about an edit, you put it back in their hands to figure out. They need to argue with each other on what's the proper thing, because it's not your job to figure out, is subject matter expert A versus B correct? It's their job to figure that out. And so get everybody in the same room, whether you're reviewing it, whether you're just coming back to meet about the reviews, get them together. And if you can't get them in the same room because they're geographically dispersed, like Leslie mentioned, get them on WebEx. Get them to collaborate in some way, whether it's on the same phone call, so that you can get them to hash out any inconsistencies in the review process. Now, one thing I will tell you is that the drafting and reviewing process is a cycle. It's going to repeat over and over and over again. And you want to repeat this process as much as possible, if you will, until you get to a point where you have a finalized storyboard. And the reason why that's so important is, again, it's much easier to make edits in a written document than it is to make edits in a course, in a authoring tool, right? And the other reason when you want to get this review process happening more than once and finalized is you don't want to have to go, especially if you get audio narration professionally recorded, you want to make sure it is as finalized as possible before you go record that audio narration. I can't tell you how many times, and this is me venting about subject matter experts, I've had to tell subject matter experts, hey, okay, this is it, you're finalized, and they go, yep, great, it's done. And then I go record audio narration, and then they come back and they have a bunch of edits still. And I've learned over the years, I have to tell my subject matter experts, all right, this is it. I'm going to go record the audio narration, and if you have edits, it's going to be costly. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be time-consuming. It's going to delay the project by X number of hours or days. You have to be upfront with them about why it's so important to finalize, because the deeper you get into the process, the harder it is to make edits, the audio narration or the development. And then, of course, finally is finalizing, and I just spoke about that, finalizing that storyboard. So I talked about how do you go from raw content to a storyboard. The last thing I want to talk about is how do you go from raw content to a storyboard to the screen. And I talked a little bit about that with that story, I think I said story mapping process where you create those sticky notes. But one of the things that I've learned to do, and I incorporate this in my process, and it's taken me several years to finally actually do this, is I create, after I've created these slides, I will develop a prototype. I will develop a course prototype of the course, and I will give that prototype to my subject matter experts to review. So why prototype? I'm curious to know. If you prototype, if you create a prototype of your course, why do you do it? How has that helped you in your process if you create prototypes? you don't mind typing in chat. And if you don't create prototypes, that's totally fine too. Yes, Julie, that's exactly, took the words right out of my mouth. It saves time because they get to buy in the look and feel before it's built. I agree with that. Buy-in from stakeholders is another chance to revise final development. If they still don't get it, putting it all together for the subject is helpful. Yes, it helps them get it. Whatever that means, I think we all know what that means. It helps them get it. It helps educate the SMEs. Yes, make sure you don't miss anything. So, what is a prototype? So let me tell you what a prototype is. This is how I define a prototype. I know we're coming to our last 7 minutes here, so I'm almost done. A prototype, for me, and a prototype might be different for you, a prototype is a sampling of slides. It might include 5 to 6 slides. It includes the general look and feel, the branding, the colors, the fonts, the layouts, the text, the images, the skin, the player, whatever you want to call that. It gives a general sense of the look and feel. It might include a title slide. It might include one or more content slides. Again, just a sampling of those slides to show what those might look like. It might include a sampling, one or more interactivity slides. You might include a sample of a click to reveal or a sample of a scenario slide. It might include a sampling of a quiz slide. And then it'll also include a sampling, if you will, of what the navigation will feel like. If it's locked down, it will illustrate that for the subject matter expert. If the navigation is conditional, they have to view something before viewing something else. That is demonstrated in the prototype. The prototype is, and I don't call it a wireframe, a prototype is a more polished version of the course, a sampling of those slides. And you give that to your subject matter expert, not to review content, because by the time you get to the prototype, content should be done and reviewed because you did the storyboard. The prototype is to help you really get buy-in on the look and feel, the navigation, what the course is going to look like before you go into full development. And that is incredibly important because you can take a storyboard and start developing the entire course, and you and your subject matter expert might have 2 completely different ideas of what that final course is going to look like. All right? So the prototype helps you get buy-in on the look and feel, the navigation, how the user is going to interact with it, the user interface design, all of those things before you go into full-blown development. You might spend 6 to 8 hours on a prototype, and you can make a lot of changes with those 6 to 8 hours. You might make a lot of decisions about the way interactivity works or whatever that might be. Versus spending 40 to 60 hours on 20 slides and your subject matter expert comes back and says, we want to change everything. I would rather change everything in those 6 to 8 slides or 5 to 6 slides than those 40 to 60 slides. All right. And I see a bunch of stuff in chat. Question, can I define the difference between a wireframe and a prototype? That's a good question. I don't consider a wireframe having a lot of visual design put into it. I consider a wireframe, this is my personal opinion, and you can disagree with me or anyone has a different definition. A wireframe for me illustrates the user interface. It illustrates where navigation lives or how navigation is restricted. All right. A wireframe typically does not include content. It might include a placeholder that says this is where an image is going to live and this is where text is going to live and this is where the button is going to live, and if you click on this button and you're not allowed to proceed, this is the pop-up. A prototype is a more polished version of a wireframe. It will include real content. Yes, the bare bones, the absolute bare bones. And I am not a big fan of showing wireframes to subject matter experts. And the reason why is when you show a wireframe to a subject matter expert, when you show something that has zero visual design, they cannot, in their heads, they cannot comprehend that that is not what the course is going to look like. Every time I've tried to show a wireframe to a client, they go, well, is that what the buttons are going to look like? And I go, no, it's just a placeholder for a button. Or they go, well, is that what the background's going to look like? It's just white. And I go, no. There's going to be a background. This is just to help them understand the navigation. And they don't get that. Unless you're working with subject matter experts that have an understanding of e-learning and they're prepared to look at a wireframe objectively. I don't like to do that. I like to show a more polished prototype. And that's why. All right, so with that being said, we have 4 minutes left, and that is how to write your first e-learning storyboard. Hey, did you like that video? Make sure to check out some of our other great content at elearninguncovered.com.